Hello, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us for the 10th and final episode of the Brisbane Writers Festival Author-Illustrator series, a series of conversations with author-illustrators about their work, their creative processes, and the things that inspire them. There's a year's worth of fantastic discussions with some of Australia's foremost creators, so make sure you catch up with previous episodes, which are all available through the Brisbane Writers Festival website. And I'm speaking to you today from Darkinjung land on the central coast of New South Wales. I'd just like to recognise the continued connection of the Darkinjung people to the land and waters of this incredible place, and acknowledge that sovereignty over the land was never ceded, and it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are listening today. It's my very great pleasure to be speaking today to the incredible Ross Morgan, who's a fine artist and illustrator hailing from Adelaide in South Australia. And Ross, you've come from a predominantly fine arts background, haven't you? So you've got quite an extensive fine arts career. I think you completed a Bachelor of Visual Arts in 2000, and since then you've exhibited in numerous solo and group exhibitions, and been recognised in major art prizes such as the Doug Moran National Portrait Prize, the Kennedy Art Prize, where you've been finalists, and you were the winner of the John Shaw Nielsen Acquisitive Art Prize as well in 2015. So you've only fairly recently arrived in the world of well, picture books particularly, and really leaning into the sort of narrative side of your art. So I think it's going to be really interesting to speak to you today about what that shift has been like for you, and what sort of triggered it, and the difference between the two worlds. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. But I mean, you know, in The Sound of Music, they say, let's start at the very beginning. It's a very good place to start. So we might jump in our time machine and just whiz straight back to your formative years before we launch into, you know, what you're up to now. Because one thing that I find endlessly fascinating is that you find that a lot of people who go on to have really creative careers have really sort of eclectic, interesting childhoods, and you can really see a strong connection between early impressions that the world made on them, and then the sort of concerns and images and symbolism that finds its way into their later work. So I think you're one of those. You had a fairly interesting sort of upbringing, didn't you?
Yeah, well, I grew up in the mid-north of South Australia, so and we had a farm, and when I was young, I used to just love exploring the farm, and the town that we lived in was really quite, it was almost like a ghost town. Like, there's all these abandoned buildings and structures and things everywhere. And so I spent most of my childhood exploring that environment, and then just finding little creatures and, you know, old bits of junk and stuff that used to just really inspire me as a kid. And I think those things have definitely, or that experience has definitely followed through into my creative side. My mum was also quite, she loved arts and crafts, and always did that with us. And I think out of all my siblings, I was the one that sort of kept going with it. So I think that there was a really strong influence from that encouragement that my mum, or just enjoying what mum used to make stuff and things like that as a kid. So I don't know, I followed in those footsteps. And then when I went to school, I think painting and drawing really started to become prominent. I had a really good art teacher at high school, and I just learned lots of little, because it was sort of like a mix of design and art that I did at school. And I think my design, design influenced a lot of my drawing and painting as well, because I love things like perspective and drawing objects and cars and people and those interrelation between objects and characters and things like that. So.
And it's interesting looking at your work, because it's almost like in your art, objects almost become a character.
That's right.
They
Yeah.
take sort of personality and presence all of their own.
Yeah. Well, I think that as a human, we just naturally are drawn to things, whether it's animals or objects or whatever. They become, there's a narrative there in a way, and how we connect with things that are special to us, I suppose. And it could be a book, it could be a just a piece of junk that you find on the side of the road or whatever. But those things that end up becoming part of you and who you are. And I think I like exploring that connection that we have with everything around us. It's a nice way to humanize what we do, I suppose, and everything is a bit definitive, I suppose, in creating who we are and the things that we collect or create. Yeah, so
you certainly really that really comes through in your work, like the sort of the significance that objects are given is really striking, like the sort of atmosphere surrounding rusty old cars or bits of industrial detritus or the sort of you're quite interested in sort of empty, rundown, abandoned spaces as well, aren't you? And I guess that comes from the childhood that you were describing and that early exploration. And but would you say as an adult you've gone on to give it a sort of a symbolic way? What do you like with when you're kind of creating that sort of setting for your work? What's the underlying?
I think in some ways I often start with the characters or just bringing two elements together, and then I start building around it, and sometimes a whole world sort of develops around it. And I think other times I think I'm inspired often by the environment, but those initial connections is where you start building upon the story. And I think that's when I guess my love of like abandoned spaces and things like that as a kid is probably what I know, like that isolated environment where you're sort of exploring this atmosphere or environment that probably was quite unique, I suppose, to my upbringing, because I lived in a place where there was hardly any people around. It was more environment than it was people. And so things like animals and objects became the focus. And so what you end up connecting with that stuff because you don't really have anything else to connect with.
So would it be fair to say that you're sort of exploring your way into the work as you're creating it, almost? Like,
yeah, definitely.
You don't start out with a fully formed plan. You just follow a thread.
Yeah. Often I just, like I was saying, just bring a couple of elements together, or just start sketching. Or often it's more painting. I'm probably more of a painter now than a drawer. Like I did a lot of drawing when I was younger, but I love to just start getting paint down on a canvas and then something grows out of it. But often those memories or just things that I like to explore end up becoming the subject matter, and then it builds and builds and builds from there. So I never really know if there's a story being developed, but often just creating something spontaneously, you might find something that you want to take further, or you see a story in it and then you start to develop it more. So that's kind of my approach most of the time, but other times I'm just inspired by things that I have found over the years, like just objects or often creatures and things like that, whether they're alive or or not. Sometimes I find that interesting as well. Like,
have you heard of the I think it's a Shinto belief. I'm going to display my ignorance because I can't remember exactly what it's called, but it's the belief that if an object is possessed and used by people for 100 years, it develops a soul and becomes animate. And
yeah,
I love that concept, like in terms of sort of old objects that have been touched and used by people. That's sort of the sense that I get from a lot of your work, is that these things.
Well, I probably inside, like, I haven't heard of that before, but when I think of my childhood and exploring those environments and knowing that people were there before and using that stuff, but they weren't there anymore, like they still felt like they had memories attached to them, or some kind of life and history. And I think that's what fascinated me as a kid, and that's why I'm drawn to that kind of environment.
So it's sort of the resonances and traces of the people who.
Yeah, because I think, like, something I sort of think of quite strongly is that we sort of are living in a world where it is all created in some ways by the remnants of humans. Like, there's hard to find an environment where, especially like urban environments and stuff, you sort of forget that what we've created is all stuff that we put there for ourselves. And then sometimes you, like when you see an animal in an urban environment, for example, you realize, oh, hang on a minute, this is our space that we've created for ourselves, but there's a creature that is trying to adapt to this environment, and I find that fascinating, that adaptation that creatures have to human-built spaces and things like that. So, and I suppose that, elements of that, I can sort of see some of these kind of artworks. I love how, I guess, resistant animals are to the artificial changes to the environment all the time. And like, I think we aren't quite the same in a lot of ways. We always are trying to adapt it to make ourselves sort of more comfortable, but then animals,
that's an interesting point.
Yeah. Whereas animals sort of just find a way to make themselves comfortable because they don't have a choice. And so I find that really interesting. It's like a real I find it sad and kind of intriguing at the same time. There's
a real poignancy to it.
Yeah, and I think growing up on a farm and seeing that, being surrounded by animals all the time, whether they were wild animals or animals like the sheep, we had like sheep property and things like that. But there's just that there's a difference as well when there's wild animals adapting to the environment. And I think some of the sort of introduced species and things like that, I found even kind of fascinating that how they adapted to that space, like the fox, rabbits and stuff like that. Like, I find that, those kind of things, it's sort of like a human introduced thing, but then they've become their own creature again, because they've adapted to an artificial space that they were put in. So I don't know, those challenges and of the environment are things that I just like to explore. And I never have any answers or know what I'm really going on about, but it's just an intrigue.
But sometimes, like, starting the conversation is important as having the answers, isn't it?
Yeah. Like, I think just exploring it is probably what I enjoy more than anything, because it sort of teaches you stuff without you actually intentionally trying to learn anything. You just start creating these like artworks, and then after going through the process, suddenly you've like learned something from your journey, and that I find that really rewarding as an artist.
Can you give
because
us an example of that, like how you, I mean, obviously there's a lot of research that goes in. Like you have the gem of the idea, and then you have to sort of flesh it out, and that's where the sort of research kicks in, isn't it? Where you're trying to kind of gather the resources that you need to kind of express your idea the way you want to. So do you have a sort of a story of the time that was particularly fascinating?
I think it happens most of the time when I create, to be honest. It only teaches you something yourself, but when you intentionally go into creating a piece, you don't intend to learn anything. You're sort of drawn to the process, and you just want to create something that the process is enjoyable. But then you look at what you've created in front of you and like, where did that idea come from and whatever, and then you start exploring it a little bit, and then the journey sort of makes you look at things that you probably weren't looking at before, and start researching things that you weren't thinking of before. And in that process, you've learned something, because it's like, I almost feel like art in a way is like being your own teacher. Like the things that you want to learn, you end up exploring, and we teach ourselves often as artists, I think, because whether it's process or whether what the subject matter of what, it's like your own research into the things that really interest you or whatever. So like, it's hard to sort of give a specific time that I've done that, because it almost feels like an ongoing thing.
Or universal, yeah.
Yeah. And
I guess different each time, depending on, what the idea is that you're sort of driven to express,
yeah.
That sort of must take you down a multiplicity of different paths, in different ways.
Yeah. And I think like things that are happening in the world at the time often influence it as well. Like I've found, like, say, some of my stories that I've been developing, like when I created it, I was like, say for one of the projects that I've sort of been self-developing is the diver, the chicken, and the fox. And
can I pause you there for a sec?
Yeah.
Because I think that's a brilliant way to start, segueing into looking at the way that you're transitioning into picture books, because I think a lot of your visual art practice, you created series of images, didn't you? Which ended up having a sort of a narrative element to them, and we're all connected. And the diver, the chicken, and fox were, that was one of those series, wasn't it, initially? And now you're transitioning it into a sort of picture book format. So I think that's a really interesting crossover.
Yeah. Well, I think like it sort of started, a lot of my artwork over the time has been, it starts off as just one image, or and then you're like, oh, I like to take that character or that painting on another journey or whatever. But then I think when I was a kid, I was always fascinated by the visual narrative anyway. So like I love picture books, and I remember sort of like early in my fine art career, I was like, oh, I'd love to be able to create picture books and whatever. And I felt like when I started to create, I think the first series of works I created where I felt like, oh, this is heading towards book territory, or because I think probably having a background in a little bit of, I have a friend who's a filmmaker, and seeing him storyboard his film sort of inspired that idea of creating multiple images to tell a story. And my first, I suppose, deliberate exhibition that I did that was called Learning to Fly, and it was just these, I actually used my nieces as the models, and it was just a little series of artworks that when you look at them individually, they're kind of artworks in themselves, but when you connect them all together, it's like watching a story take place. And I really liked where it was going. And then I started playing more and more with that. And I think at the time I was doing that and a lot of portraiture. And then one day randomly, I just started sketching foxes, and because I've always been a bit like fascinated by them, I think, from my childhood, because they sort of were just this intriguing creature out in the, amongst all the rubbish. But I also, when I was doing all those little sketches and things like that, I was fascinated, obviously, by objects and stuff as well. And I painted a diver, and I was like, oh, yes, I really like just the look of that. It's quite surreal. And I thought, what would the diver?
Just behind you, isn't it, with the fox? You can see over your
that's a more recent one, but right. I did this painting of a diver, and I thought, oh, what would be kind of weird? What can I introduce into the diver painting to make it feel a little bit more surreal? And then I put a chicken in it. I kind of
make everything surreal.
Yeah, but it was almost like my first thought was when I created that piece, I think, was thinking of being on our farm, and it would be so surreal to see a diver out there feeding the chooks or something. And so that was kind of like the beginning of the like that. It was a really surreal probably beginning to it. But then because I was fascinated with the fox, I sort of introduced the foxes into it. And then I was like, oh, this is a really interesting, combo of characters. Maybe I'll just explore that. And then that's when the series of paintings sort of developed for the Diver, Chicken and Fox exhibition. And I think when I did the exhibition, I didn't really know what it was about or the world that they were in or whatever. It was just these three characters and how they interrelate to each other. And I really liked that exploration of bringing strange things together and then taking them on a journey to make them actually, the reason they're together means something. And so that's probably, I think that really inspired my whole way of working in some ways, like just bringing elements together and then like, oh, there's a story that I can tell. How do these things interrelate with each other? And I think that it's kind of a bit like life, like you never know what's going to be around the corner sort of thing. And so, but that's kind of a story that's how stories sort of begin, when things are joined together. So
yeah, it's really interesting hearing you say that it was just really an exercise and what would be a ridiculous thing to pair with this diver and, going for something totally left of field and surreal, because I hopefully we'll be able to show people some of the images, but I think, the final paintings have so much kind of presence and sort of emotional weight to them, and it feels kind of right that these three are together, and it feels portentous and it feels meaningful. And there's a real sort of poignancy to it as well, a real emotional punch to the images. And it's amazing hearing about that journey and seeing the starting point and then comparing that to the end result.
Well, it's probably a little bit like you asked before about an example of when I've learned something from my artwork, and that's an example of how it's come together. Like, I didn't know what I intended when I created those, like I brought those characters together, but then suddenly they started to tell me where they wanted to go, and then I learned something from that experience, like why are they together, and what does a diver mean, what does a chicken mean, and
it's become a bit of almost an allegory for environmental degradation and preserving what we have left, and it, in a way.
Well, the story, I think the way that I've sort of been building the story, like the initial exhibition, I don't think there was an environment that I was sort of exploring. It was, like I was saying before, it's just the characters. But I think, like, not long after I did that exhibition, I did my first book, I won a mentorship, and getting to learn the process of creating a book gave me the tools to sort of adapt my exhibition work into sort of start molding it into a book format rather than. So I think The Diver Chicken Fox is kind of an interesting, it's going to be an interesting book in some ways to work on, because it began as an exhibition, whereas some of the other stuff since then I've done has been manuscript, then storyboard, and I sort of build it based on things that I've created. But to take something that was an artwork initially and then almost sort of in reverse,
retrofit it.
Yeah.
Engineering.
Yeah. So I think that's kind of how I've been adapting it in a lot of ways, is just using all those tools. And then, like when you're doing exhibition, you don't have boundaries, but when you're creating picture books, you do. And in some ways that makes you more creative, because you can't, you have to make it work for what resources are available. So, like a 32-page book, suddenly you've got these boundaries that you have to try and work within. And so, like in my head, the world is bigger than a 32-page picture book. But I do feel like it's nice to have those boundaries, because then I can start to, weave my way and take things out that don't need to be there, or picture an environment that is probably a little bit more around the characters rather than the whole whole world that I see. So
this might be a good time to talk about Glow, which is a picture book you've written and you're illustrating for Walker Books at the moment. And that one you have started from the outset with a picture book in mind, and built it from the bottom up. So maybe just speak a little bit about that process and how that's been.
Well, that was an interesting concept, actually, the way that came together, because I don't really like to call myself a musician, but I do like to play around on like little compositions and stuff like that. And I came up with this little piece of music during a Christmas break. And after I created the piece of music, the music kind of gave me this like vision of, or this experience of like a little girl and a dog digging up this object out of the ground. And then I know that's kind of what the piece of music inspired. And then
is that just to kind of get this clear in my head, is this you sort of wrote the music freeform, and then when is it in the process of creating the music that this narrative comes to you, or is it when you listen back to it and just experience it?
It was kind of partway through. I think I was just playing around with music. It wasn't really I didn't have a narrative in mind or anything like that. But then what I listened to while I was creating, it's probably the same process again of something being taught to you while you're going through the process. I started to visualize what the sound. It was quite an atmospheric kind of piece of music, but I visualized it, a story, or almost like a film in my head starting to take shape. And that
you wrote the soundtrack before you made the movie.
Yeah. and so that was sort of like the beginnings of that. And it was quite a simple idea. It was just basically, a dog and a little girl digging this object out of the ground, and then it rises out of the ground and thanks them, and then goes off into the atmosphere. And that was kind of the whole idea of the piece of music. But then when I thought, that could be a nice little thing to explore as a picture book. But then I thought, if I did that just as a picture book, it would just be pages and pages of them digging digging a hole, and I was like, well, that was probably not that interesting. But so then I started to sort of, what is this world that the dog and the girl live in, and so I started expanding on the environment, and then it was almost like, oh, it's a little bit like the environment that I explored as a child, and so the story sort of grew from there. And it's like, what is this thing that they're digging up, and how come it's special to this girl, and things like that. And so they're the questions I asked myself while I started creating the sketches or storyboards, and then you come up with different scenarios of what it might be, and then suddenly you're forming a narrative, and that was kind of how that one developed.
So what was the answer to that question that you settled on in the end?
What was that?
The why are they digging? What sort of that underlying sort of story?
Well, the object in the ground is special to the girl, and I guess it's hard. It's quite a abstract concept, but it is the objects in the environment that she is surrounded by is the world that her grandfather or a parent figure, that's where they live, and all the objects are special to her, but she's lost this special person in her life. And then the journey of the book is basically a one-day journey of after they've dug up this object and they're ready to set it free. I ended up, and it's actually the soul of the person that she's lost. And so there's this little connection to the objects, and it's such a hard thing to explain.
I think you're doing great. I mean, yeah.
Like, I do find that, like, the process of creating this book and a lot of my books, I find really difficult to communicate verbally, like, because it's such a visual exploration. And I do use a lot of metaphor, and objects become symbolic, and I don't often know what I'm intending a lot of the time. I like to give it some
until it's done, and then you realize.
Yeah.
So in this situation, you've started off with just this one little gem of an idea sparked by a piece of music, and it's basically turned into a sort of an exploration of the grieving process, really, I suppose.
Yeah. And like you were saying before about memories being attached to objects and stuff, I think that's probably what I was sort of exploring a little bit there, but I hadn't really heard it before,
the recurring theme. And the initial setting where you're first introduced to the little girl, she's in a workshop, isn't she, that she shared with the person that she's lost, and they sort of and all of the projects that they sort of tinkered with and worked on together.
Yeah, well, it might be good. I could show you some things that it sort of might inspire what. Like, I did this as a larger painting years ago, but it was kind of I'm doing a smaller version now for the book, but this character sort of felt like it connected with the story in a way, because the environment felt like it was created from surrounded by metal and scraps and things like that. And I like the idea of using those scraps to create your own little artworks or whatever. And the little girl in the story, whether it's the parent figure in it, loves to tinker, like it must be like a little engineer, or and they made like little toys together, and that was one of the toys that they were working on, but it wasn't finished before they passed away. And so I have another one here that sort of, when she's going on the journey throughout the world, she's got it in her backpack, sort of unfinished. And you can sort of see how the environment sort of influences the creating your own little objects and things.
Absolutely.
From the world around you. But that connection, I guess, that she has to that unfinished toy is quite special, because it was something that they were working on together that wasn't complete. And so, and then the journey that she goes on to this special place where this object's buried underneath, there's like a, the day that she's going, they've discovered that there's a big key to turn on this object. And that's basically what the story is, sort of leading to the journey of the day that she turns the key with the dog. And yeah.
It sounds like your kind of sensibility for narrative lends itself beautifully to picture books too, because like I think one thing that makes really great picture books stand apart is that kind of those visual subtexts that sort of, you see, you've got stories within stories, and you've got clues and hints that the reader can piece together to sort of, you know, sort of solve the puzzle of what the significance of the main story is, and you know, that's perfect, giving the reader agency to kind of connect the dots. And
yeah, well, I think in a lot of ways I create picture books more so like I create my art, in a way that I try and use the visuals to tell the story or create a conversation or a concept, rather than actually trying to tell a complete narrative from start to finish. I think my art in the past was always about exploring just a little scenario and how many avenues you could go from just that, creating that scenario. Like when I did the Diver Chicken and Fox, that was, you know, I could have gone in so many directions with that. And that's the same with this book. And I think creating the art tells you what you do next. Whereas like writing a story, sometimes you sort of, you know, you have so many, it's like choose your own adventure. And I think that in some ways that's what I do as a creator with my art, is I paint something, I'm like, oh, what do I do now? Where are they going to go? Where are these? And so in some ways that's the process of creating it is almost like that as well. And so when I come up with an idea, I don't really know how it's going to end.
That was my next question, was actually like, you know, because you're coming from a fine arts background and a very visual sort of perspective, how do you find the writing side of it? Like, is that does that come naturally, or are you having to sort of find your voice there, or
a little bit? Yeah, I haven't really written much in the way of stories I've written songs, and I do like poetry and like rhyme and things like that for songwriting. But I think as a specific, I don't like to sort of call myself a writer. I feel like a fraud if I said I was a writer.
Oh, we all suffer from imposter syndrome. Don't worry about
it. But I think, yeah, the images drive everything. So, and
are you finding the writing becomes a way of kind of crystallizing what you're saying in the image, or are you?
I'd say with Glow, it was like finding a thread that joined everything together. Like I didn't really know where I was going, how I was going to end it, or how the journey was going to sort of become, you know, a start to finish thing. Like I almost like to finish a story by starting again. like there's a new thing to start. But I think when I did Glow, I found almost like a theme, and grief was the theme that sort of tied it together. And then I started to sort of look at the things that I'd created and how grief can be sort of interpreted amongst that. And so I think of Glow as really, it's like a metaphoric journey of grief and how to deal with losing somebody special. And so and I think the text that I wrote for it was basically like a song where the lyrics don't necessarily tell you what's going on. It's just like about the emotion or the feelings that you sort of go through. And so, but those things started to drive sort of where I finished the artworks in a way.
So you started with the art, and then the writing sort of kicked in, and then halfway through the writing started to drive the art. Is that the
it was a really strange kind of process, and I can't really, it's not clear to me how I did it. It's kind of, I almost feel
probably the next one will be completely different.
I almost feel a little bit like, how did a book come out of this? Like, I don't know how I created this. Like, I just started with a little piece of music, and then it turned into like this vision of something, and then I started doing, it just sort of grew out of spontaneous.
And with the text, you ended up writing it as a sort of almost like the little girl's internal dialogue. Sort of soliloquy spoken by the little girl. Did you have that? Did you decide that was the form it was going to take from the outset, or did it start off?
I think it was probably in some ways, like, some of the lines in it are probably, personal in a way. Like, it was almost like, going through grief myself as a child. Some of the things that you keep to yourself and whatever, but then it's sort of like this journey you go through of the personal experiences, but then letting them go as well. It was a hard to sort of picture that it was the little girl. I think I'm just sort of picturing myself, and I in some ways I think I'm putting my, like, the journey that the little girl takes is kind of like my own understanding of dealing with grief as a child. But I kind of find that the journey of grief doesn't matter what age you are. It almost feels like it's, like, from my understanding, it feels like it's very similar amongst everybody, no matter whether you're like 5 years old or whether you're 40 years old or whatever. But it's still, like, it's sort of a journey that I think humans probably just, have to sort of learn how to deal with it within ourselves. Because, and that, I think that's really what the narrative is, and the words are sort of like more personal, inner words, rather than a specific character and their feelings. But it was the little girl.
She's just become a sort of a focal point for that universal emotion. But when will people be able to? When's the publication date for Glow, or is that still in flux?
I'm still only moments away from finishing it off. I actually I nearly finished. I had another book project that I was putting aside so I could finish Glow, and then I got sick, and then the other one, and then it ended up sort of throwing all the deadlines out of whack. So I've sort of put it aside, and I'm back on it now, just finishing it off, and I'll probably have it finished in the next week or so.
Actually, speaking of juggling deadlines, that was one thing I was really interested to ask you, which is conscious we're probably getting on towards time, because this has just flown by, so I'm going to ask you it quickly before the clock runs out.
Yeah.
But one thing I was really interested in hearing from you about was just the process of coming into the publishing world and suddenly juggling those deadlines and working collaboratively with editors, and having a number of projects stacked up and having to manage all that around the demands of sort of everyday life. Like, what's that shift been like for you, and what's been surprising about it?
It's been very hard. It was a bit overwhelming, actually, but because I was working part-time while I was creating my first book, and that was kind of good in a way, because I had money coming in while I was creating. But when I got three, this year I've been working on three, and it's just like there's not enough time to have a part-time job when you've got so much projects to finish, and financially it's like, oh man, I have to pay for this. I'm not earning any income while you're doing it. So it's been really challenging in that regard, like financially trying to like, I was very lucky that I sold some of the artwork from my previous book to sort of fund this last 12 months of working on my own book. But I think that's probably been one of the most challenging things. But I think juggling deadlines is difficult, because everything takes a lot longer than you than you need to. And I think I've learned that if I want to do more books, I'd rather do the whole book first and then go on to the next project. But I think having three that you're juggling at once starts to become
a bit impossible.
Yeah, like I think it just sends you a bit mad.
Yeah. Like, and I think that is something that doesn't get talked about often enough, is that the publishing industry in Australia is quite small, and there just aren't the huge advances that there are overseas and things, and most people end up cobbling together a sort of a working life that has multiple income streams, and finding a balance between doing the books justice, keeping food on the table, sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, so I have found this year quite challenging in that regard, and I think, in some ways, it was good working on multiple projects. I think I enjoy the creative part of it, but when it comes to doing the final artwork, when you're trying to do final artwork for multiple at the same time,
especially with your technique, because it's it's labor intensive and it's involved, and it's not something you want to shortchange.
Yeah, like if I was doing, like, say, a storyboard for one and the final art for another, I'd probably find that process, easy to juggle. But when you're sort of mixing colors and you're like, oh, I've ended up making like lots of like little pots of color that I just use across all the books now. Like I've created like a little color palette, so that I don't have to keep mixing it every time I do it. So that's kind of helped. So the color palette for probably two of my books is almost exactly the same, just because mixing the same color multiple times can become quite hard to match, especially if you're doing it like with a picture book, especially like because it is you're trying to get a consistency across 32 pages. You kind of need the same colors to sort of be in those, and it's like a little
so I guess that's been part of the steep learning curve of this year as well, just finding techniques and methods that are going to work to sort of handle it. And so what's next for you? What have you got with your newfound wisdom of like not taking on 3 books at once? But what's in the pipeline?
Well, the Diver Chicken and Fox is definitely something that I want to invest more time in, and I'd love to get that, like just spend a time getting that completely sort of
Realize.
realized. I've also got a couple of other ideas that I've been exploring as well. This one's kind of another like an exploration of like how collective of animals sort of interact with the built environment, and like I was talking about earlier, like I like that idea of how animals adapt to the human world. That's been something that I've been intrigued with for a long time, and I've created like a concept that explores that with multiple different collectives of animals. So
is it based around collective nouns?
Yeah, so it was a concept that I actually submitted to the Squibby like emerging illustrator like award, and I got shortlisted for that concept, which was really nice.
Fantastic. For people who don't know Squibby, it's the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators, which is a fantastic organisation for supporting authors and illustrators.
Yeah, they've been amazing. I probably wouldn't be where I am today without
me neither. Yeah.
So but that's probably.
And you're working on another book with Alan and Unwin at the moment?
No, it's with Hachette, actually.
Hachette, that's right.
There's one called The Gargoyle, and actually there's got a couple of, I did some little pencil sketches and stuff, but that the last that'll be out in, I think, April or May. I only just finished all the final artwork for that a couple of days ago, so I probably look a bit like a gargoyle at the moment.
Well, you're remarkably coherent.
But yeah, that was a beautiful story, and I just had to illustrate it, and it was really like the experience of that, I think, was probably one of the big learning curves this year, because of how strict the deadlines were in comparison to what I've been working on previously, and so I really had to push myself to like get that working for the deadline, because they have a publication date already set in mind well before you start, and so I got there. But yeah, it was a real juggle. But yeah, I'm excited about that one. That's such a beautiful story.
That's brilliant. So there's lots to look forward to coming out from you in the next year, I guess.
Yeah, and then I finished one previously, and that comes out in April, I think, or no, maybe February, I think. And it's called Hedgehog the Wonder Dog, which I started that probably just a little bit more, probably about 18 months ago, maybe I started that. But that they're all sort of the deadlines all sort of just like yeah.
Well, maybe you can, once Glow's done, you can take a breath and look around you, and then start exploring again and see where it takes you.
I think that's when most of the creative stuff happens. Like when I wrote Glow, it was like during a Christmas break when I just took some time off, and having just some free headspace, I think, gives you that ability to.
Speaking of free headspace, this brings me to my next and final burning question, which is, when you do have some space and time to just create, and you don't have the pressure of deadlines breathing down your neck and things, and you're in the zone, and you manage to sort of disappear into the work, if the inside of your mind at that point was a physical space, and you could stand in it and look around and start exploring, what sort of space would you be standing in? What would you be seeing?
I'd probably be in the junkyard. Yeah, it probably is like the child that I used to. It's like probably be a rural environment filled with like just objects everywhere and going exploring and yeah, just finding creatures and things that intrigue me. Yeah, I guess that's what the space is. It's hard to know, but I think it's often I have like quite an emotive space when I'm like doing something like music. Though it's almost like I don't actually physically visualize a space. I start to sort of feel emotion probably, and so I think my when my mind is like that, I just start to sort of explore emotions probably more so, and yeah, it's not really a physical space that I can imagine. I hadn't really thought of that. Yeah.
So you're taking down feelings.
Yeah, like I do find I was a very sensitive kid, and I haven't really grown out of that. Like, so I think there's an element like when I think of objects and creatures and stuff, I sort of put myself in their shoes, or like I like to pretend that I'm the characters in a way. So when I do invest in creating a story, I become who is the character, and imagine what they might be thinking or whatever. So I guess my mind is probably pretending to be, probably that play that you have as a child, pretending to be something, and that's probably what that my empty mind would be like that in some ways, like being something else.
Stepping into something else's skin.
Yeah.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Well,
I probably didn't explain that very well.
no, that was beautiful. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and I really hope you get Glow wrapped up and get to take a well-earned rest for a little bit. And
yeah, I'm really excited about all the stuff that I've created over the last 18 months. It's been big, but I can't wait. Yeah, I can't wait to share it with everybody. It's been great. So
can't wait to see it. Well, thanks so much, Ross, and happy painting.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Cheers.
Bye.